Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and today I'm going to take a look at some rock and metal vocalists who get way too much hate. I have 7 names that came to mind. So let's get started here at number 7. These are in no particular order. I'm going to go with Dave Mustaine of Megadeth, and it's easy to understand why Dave Mustaine's vocals can be grating to some after a while. I mean, nobody, Dave included, is claiming that he's the greatest singer out there, but somehow it works within the Megadeth sound, and I wouldn't want anybody else to sing on tracks like Hangar 18 or In My Darkest Hour, and the squeaky, unpolished vocals, they work for one reason or another, and Dave probably hit his vocal peak around Countdown to Extinction through Risk, that era there in the 90s where, you know, it was more than passable, right? And his voice is definitely unique. He's able to utilize his vocals in many different ways, and in terms of technique, Dave has always been rough around the edges, but somehow it works, and it fits the thrash sound perfectly, and, you know, it's also totally within the Megadeth attitude, where Dave starts the band after being booted from Metallica and just says, well, I'll do it myself. Number 6, let's go with Attila from Mayhem. And am I the only one who actually prefers Attila's vocals to Dead's? I mean, I know that his voice isn't everyone's thing, obviously, but personally, he's my favorite Mayhem vocalist, and I think his timing is great, and I really appreciate his versatility, as he can do, you know, traditional black metal shrieks very well, but it's also able to incorporate, you know, throat singing and cleans, and I think that lends to a lot of variety in his songs, and I think he's great on Watchers, Illuminate, Eliminate, and the 2022 version live of Symbols and Blood Swords, so, you know, just a few that came to mind for me, and his voice has also come a long way since 1993, 1994, and while I do enjoy the studio version of the album De Mysteris Dom Satanas, I enjoy his performance on, you know, some of the more recent live performances, you know, a lot more, and probably an unpopular opinion, especially amongst Mayhem fans, but I think he's the best vocalist Mayhem ever had. Number 5 for you, let's go with Tim Aymar of Control Denied and Pharoah, and, you know, a lot of people like to pick on Tim Aymar's vocals on the only Control Denied record, but I actually really dig his work on The Fragile Art of Existence. You know, I think the two biggest problems he probably faced were that, you know, he wasn't even the best singer in the band, and, you know, Chuck Schuldiner just didn't really seem to know how to write, I'd say, for a clean vocalist. That said, I think his delivery is really unique on that album, despite it sounding a bit odd to hear, you know, Chuck writing material for clean vocals, and also did some great work with Pharoah, you know, great power metal band there, and I think his vocals get a lot of hate, and they aren't everyone's thing, but I think they, you know, everyone had a preconceived notion of, you know, what Control Denied would sound like based on Chuck's work with Death, but Tim took the ball and ran with it. I think he turned, you know, a lot of Chuck's lyrics into something really special on that record, and had they made more albums, I think Tim would have eased into the role really well, and I think people would have really grown on, you know, the Control Denied sound with Tim Aymar on lead vocals, you know, once you get over the initial hurdle that it's not the same sound as Death. Number 4, gonna go with Tim Ripper Owens, and, you know, while not great albums, Jugulator and Demolition are, you know, really heavy records, and musically make sense as follow-ups to the Painkiller album, just without Rob Halford, wherein lies, you know, the bigger problem here, which is, you know, Ripper had the insane task, I guess you could say, of trying to fill the massive shoes of the metal god in Judas Priest for a decade, while Halford did some of the best work of his career, you know, first with Fight, and then some solo stuff under the name Halford, right, with Crucible and Resurrection, 2 fantastic records. And so during that time period, Priest were kind of treading water, and to be fair, there's only one Rob Halford. So, you know, Ripper Owens had an uphill battle from the beginning, but I don't think Ripper should take the blame for, you know, a pretty mediocre period in the band's history personally, and granted, the Ripper era of Judas Priest is not top shelf by any means, but I don't really think that's the fault of Ripper. I think those albums mainly suffer from, you know, poor production and shoddy songwriting from KK Downing and Glenn Tipton, but since then, he's really become the ultimate metal journeyman, right? I think he's done some phenomenal work with Iced Earth. I really love his work on the Glorious Burden, phenomenal record, and for me personally, his period in Iced Earth there, that era where he's on lead vocals, is my favorite era of Iced Earth. Love that era of the band. The Glorious Burden is a masterpiece, like I said, and he's also worked with Yngwie Malmsteen's Rising Force, and more recently, Ripper's been killing it with KK Downing on KK's Priest. Saw them live last year with Accept. It was a phenomenal show, and Ripper is still great live as well. You know, when Ripper got the cold shoulder during his time with the band, no doubt about it, and that era isn't typically looked back upon fondly, but the dude is insanely talented, has a great range, and has done excellent work with multiple bands over the last 20 years. How about Blaze Bayley, formerly of Iron Maiden? And I think Blaze's biggest crime in the eyes of Iron Maiden fans was simply not being Bruce Dickinson, kind of like what I was talking about with Ripper Owens, right? But I know the Blaze era may have aged a little better now, and people have more of an open mind on the albums The X Factor and Virtual 11 now than they did back then, but at the time, Maiden fans wanted a reunion with Bruce and mostly rejected this new era of the band as Maiden began playing smaller and smaller venues as a result, and Blaze's voice can definitely be a bit one-dimensional at times, but Iron Maiden hired him out of hundreds and hundreds of auditions and applicants, and so he did the job that he was hired to do during his tenure with the band. But the biggest issue was the guy was never given a fighting chance. The fans rejected this new era immediately, and on top of that, Maiden would not accommodate him live at all. Blaze was not Bruce Dickinson, but the band still refused to, change the sound and played as if Bruce was still in the band, still up there with them on stage, refusing to tune down to better fit his voice or to slow down so it wouldn't sound like Blaze was constantly trying to catch his breath while doing the Bruce era material. And Maiden fans may have warmed up to Blaze now, but, at the time, and I think probably the fact that they warmed up to Blaze now is only because Bruce is back in the band, but at the time, he definitely was given the cold shoulder by the fans, who were chanting Bruce's name during the band's shows, and, comparing him to the greatest metal vocalist of all time, which is just plain unfair and disrespectful, and it wasn't his fault that, Bruce left, right? Blaze comes in, and he was hired to do that job. It's also worth noting that Blaze did some really underrated work with Wolfsbane prior to, joining Iron Maiden, and also his solo stuff is really good as well. The Silicon Messiah is a masterpiece of a record. Love this album to death, and he's actually going to be touring the X Factor in its entirety soon, and some of those songs are longer and more plotting. They might not come off well live, but I'm still really interested in how that's going to sound. I'd love to hear it live as well, if only he'd announce some US dates. Online, you always see James LaBrie of Dream Theater on these lists of, vocalists that, people just can't stand, and his live vocals have become the target of massive criticism over the last few years, with a small contingent of Dream Theater fans, even calling for his retirement or removal from the band. But my question to those people is that really what you want? Do you really want James LaBrie out of Dream Theater and the band to start over with another vocalist at this point? At this point, every member of Dream Theater is crucial to the band's formula, and removing one is going to make the whole thing feel empty. People didn't like it when Portnoy left. They definitely will not like it if, James LaBrie leaves as well, if he's sacked after 35 years. And personally, I don't have a problem with his vocals, but I'm also not going to compare them to the way that he sounded, before he injured his vocal cords back in 1994. What I love about LaBrie's modern-day vocals is his delivery. He's able to, put so much emotion into his voice, and he's not able to hit those high notes anymore, but that's okay, His vocals are just as crucial to Dream Theater as John Petrucci's guitar or Mike Portnoy's drumming and songwriting, and it would be weird to hear anybody else, do lead vocals on classic tracks like The Spirit Carries On or Pull Me Under, and nobody does ballads better than Dream Theater, and, I think the slower, more melodic songs like Hollow Years or Through My Words, even Bend the Clock from Parasomnia, their most recent album, is a great showcase for his aged vocals and what he still has to offer. And, he joined the band in 1990, replacing Charlie Dominici. I've also heard them say Charlie Dominici, so not quite sure how to pronounce that. I've heard two different pronunciations, but when he joined, he helped to take the band to the next level and contributed a ton to, the vocal melodies of all those classic albums. So I think his vocals sounded most motivated that they have in years on Parasomnia, personally. And I think having Portnoy back in the band definitely did rejuvenate Dream Theater in a lot of ways. And for people who find his recent, live performances to be, grating on their ears, certainly entitled to that opinion, and nobody's forcing you to go to the shows, but I'd much rather a 62-year-old vocalist give us a real show and perform to the best of his abilities rather than mime to a tape and pretend to be something that they're not, It's not 1992 anymore, and that's okay. And last but not least, everyone can start spamming E in the comments section. We have Chris Barnes of Cannibal Corpse and 6 Feet Under. Chris Barnes is usually the first name that comes to mind when people think of the worst metal vocalist in the scene today, and admittedly, his vocals on the more recent 6 Feet Under records are not what they used to be, but, this is another example of holding an older musician to, the same standards that we did when he was 30 years younger. And I may be a little bit biased because the, Chris Barnes era of Cannibal Corpse is my personal favorite era of the band, but he did some legendary work on timeless records like Butchered at Birth, Tomb of the Mutilated, and The Bleeding, and I like 6 Feet Under as well. Granted, their last few records have not been that good, but I attribute my personal dislike of those albums to, a lack of interesting music rather than Chris's vocals, which are definitely not what they used to be, but a 57-year-old man who did not take care of his voice isn't going to sound the same way that he did when he was in his 20s. So that wraps up this video here, taking a look at some overhated metal vocalists. You guys can see my picks right over here, and the thing is, with these singers, you want to enjoy their music while they're still here. In the case of Tim Aymar, he's no longer here. He passed away in 2023, but all of these singers are still making music. They're still alive, and so I think we shouldn't take for granted the fact that they're still here and still recording, and even if their voices might not be what they used to be, or maybe you could never, get into their vocals, that's totally fine, but, we shouldn't criticize them while they're still making music, because once they're gone, there aren't a lot of bands coming to take their place, and there'll never be another James LaBrie. There'll never be another Dave Mustaine. There'll never be another Tim Ripper Owens. And so even if we're not fans of what they're doing now, personally, I enjoy a lot of what these guys are doing now. But even if you're not, don't take for granted the fact that they're still making music, because when they're retired, you're going to miss them. Trust me on that. So just wanted to talk about that here today on the channel. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new upload, and let me know down in the comment section below what are your thoughts on my picks, and what are some other overhated metal vocalists. I want to hear from you. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.